But another part of it is also just simply when we're dealing with certain, I guess, economic problems or social problems, every generation feels entitled to get something. So when you're having a very expansive government, when you're having a very hands-on government that's telling you we're going to do all these things for you, that's effectively what creates the entitlement. And boomers in general, they had certain expectations given the significance of our country. You know, we lived in the United States at this time. We were the greatest country on earth, and we were the greatest civilization, the greatest empire, and ultimately we had certain expectations. And many of these expectations were things that they just didn't get at the time. So it was pissing people off. Meanwhile, you have people younger than them, and they have these new expectations, and it's because they're listening to new people, new intellectuals, and they're telling them these should be your demands. At the same time, you're having different groups in society amass power or decide to get more active and involved in the political process. And when you're looking at, for example, the benefits that a lot of African Americans received because of the civil rights movement, you're going to get other groups doing the same thing. And then when you're looking at, for example, Zoomers in particular, or even some millennials, this is just all that we know at this time. We expect, handouts. We expect government to be very hands-on. We feel as if we're entitled to a lot of things. We also hate boomers in the past because we feel as if they've squandered, the wealth of this country in particular. They're able to get Social Security benefits, but we won't. They had better access to healthcare. Things were cheaper. So we're demanding all these things. And when you're looking at politicians in particular, if you want to get elected, the best way to get elected is to promise something to someone. So there were different generations of intellectuals and politicians promising things to different groups. And that's what creates the generational divide. One generation expects their demands to be received, and they're going to criticize the other generation if their demands aren't the same, or if they feel as if, we're too entitled because we didn't have to deal with the same things that our ancestors did in the past.
Okay. I know you mentioned earlier for the previous author we were discussing that Bloom was more of a descriptive, not prescriptive author in his book. Would you say for Caldwell, though, it'd be the opposite, where he's more prescriptive? What do you think, like, policy or societal solutions did he recommend to address what he sees as an issue relating to entitlement? And what are some of your opinions with these implications in his proposed solutions?
It's interesting that you bring this up again, because one of the issues that I have with a lot of these writers is that I feel as if they don't want to tell us what are the solutions to all of the issues that we're dealing with. I don't know if it's because A, they just don't have the solutions themselves, or B, it's because they're worried that they're going to be, attacked or ridiculed by so many people on the left and on the right. So he didn't really have any solutions to this, which is definitely something that pissed me off. It frustrated me. But he was just sort of telling us that, look, we have all these issues and we have all these problems, and if we don't fix it, well then, what's to occur. But I do think to some extent Bloom and Caldwell are of the same mindset, that there's this concept that, many people talk about in modern times, which is that we have to get to colorblindness, through the law and whatnot, and that's how we fix all these things. But that begs the question, well, then how do we do this? What's going on? And then the second question after that is, do Americans even want this? So again, we're left with, wondering and trying to figure out what's going on. And I mean, not trying to figure out what's going on, but how do we fix this? And he doesn't do that. But luckily the third author, he has a few solutions. But I would say that if you were to ask me, what are my solutions ultimately, I do think that states in general certainly have to be willing to take power and say no to the expansion of the civil rights movement. Because if we're someone we're even looking to strive for color blindness, we can't do that with the Civil Rights Constitution. It's just impossible. We certainly would have to go back and remember the ideas and the values that our founders had ultimately.
Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that, because we said earlier the unintended consequence, and when you're talking about colorblindness in today's society, it comes with almost like an asterisk mark on it, where it's like color blindness, but more of rules for thee, but not for me. And a good example for this is how we see in universities like Harvard, for example, they have funny enough, a black-only graduation celebration or black-only zones where you're not allowed to enter unless you're this, racial color. And even worse, when it comes to affirmative action, there's currently an ongoing lawsuit that I believe just finished recently where Asian students were complaining to Harvard due to affirmative action because they were predominantly the ones getting into Harvard. And they noticed like, hey, you guys are artificially deflating our SAT scores to bring in other people who had lower scores than ours and get them in there just to fill a quota or a check mark, where it's becoming almost a sense of diversity for the sake of diversity alone, as in we're just checking a box or meeting a quota, which I think is very unfortunate, especially in a form of academia.
Yeah, definitely. In a lot of ways, that's kind of the only thing that they can really do at this point. Mainly, they basically have to continuously cater to these new groups, or these new groups will try to find someone else to advance their own agenda. And I think the one thing you're starting to see is that when kids feel as if they can't get the education that they demand, or kids feel as if they're being discriminated against, it sort of, begs the question, well, is discrimination really a bad thing, or is it more along the lines of discrimination for me but not for thee? And when you have a situation like that, and parents are now all of a sudden becoming angry or frustrated, and academics are starting to point out that this has just been an objective failure, the system begins to crumble, and they have to figure out a way to address all of the concerns that so many people have. And it's a lot harder for us to make this point or sell this point when it comes to things such as academia, because someone can always make the argument that, well, this private school didn't really have to accept you, which is true. I am sympathetic to that argument. Harvard doesn't have to accept some of the students that they would be willing to, that they would have been willing to accept 60 years ago, given their scores. But when you're now affected by what kind of jobs prospects you will have, or whether or not you can you will have a certain level of income, that's when people really begin to get frustrated, because now you're messing with people's livelihoods, you're messing with people's families, and it's difficult for communities to be willing to accept the new age way of looking at things.
Yeah, and I know this is a bit off topic, but that reminds me of a writer, Thomas Sowell. I'm sure you're familiar with him, where one of his critiques to affirmative action, where he feels is almost alienates people that it tends to benefit, because he put it as when he was younger going to university, let's say a surgeon, he is an African American, and he said he would have to work twice as hard as everyone else, but because of that, everyone in his field would respect him because they knew he had a lot of other hurdles to hop over than the rest of the people, as in he didn't have his parents going to these universities. He had to work and, excuse my language, bust his ass off to get there. While he would argue, because of affirmative action, you can see statistically that a lot of these minority groups that are being sent to these colleges that are above their SAT scores or above their academia level, they tend to drop out and be almost a drag to the curriculum and the courses where the classrooms are in. And they almost get pushed back and alienated because people feel like, okay, you just got here because of a handout, which is unfortunate. But that's why Sowell, for example, would argue it's better to go to, let's say, a middle or average road academia or university. And if you could prove your worth there, as in you work, you get good grades, let's say you make the dean's list, you could eventually go to these better colleges. Do you have any thoughts on that, or would you say that's pretty solid in line?
Yeah, that's pretty solid in line. And, Sowell's really good at addressing civil rights legislation, and he's really good at addressing intellectuals and race and whatnot. But, that argument was always really strong, and I don't think the other side really has a compelling case against it. But there are a couple of other things that I think we have to unpack when we're talking about this, which is that even when we're talking about many of these minorities that are going to these well-known institutions, a lot of them weren't actually ever discriminated against. In the case of Black Americans in particular, a lot of the beneficiaries are people that weren't descendants of, American slaves. A lot of them come from Nigeria, the Congo, Ghana, wherever. And it sort of begs the question of, are you just simply looking to hire, a Black person, or are you actually trying to address the injustice that occurred for African Americans overall as a whole. But another issue, I think, in particular, that which is something that I don't necessarily think Soul talks about too much, but a lot of other intellectuals talk about, is the fact that maybe these people just don't care, because at the end of the day, you definitely need minorities that are in power